Admiral James Carter walked into the busy airport, rolling his suitcase behind him. He had spent over 30 years serving in the Navy, leading missions, commanding ships, and making tough decisions that shaped his country's security. But today, there was no war zone, no strategy meeting, just a simple flight home. He was dressed in a comfortable polo shirt and jeans, looking like any other passenger. As he approached the check-in counter, he handed over his ID and ticket. The airline employee smiled politely, typed something into the computer, and then handed him a first-class boarding pass. It was an upgrade, a perk he often received because of his frequent travel. Carter nodded his thanks, took his ticket, and made his way to the security checkpoint. The airport was packed with travelers rushing in different directions. Families struggled to keep their children in line, business professionals talked on phones, and vacationers flipped through passports. Carter moved calmly through the crowd, his years in the Navy giving him a patience most people didn't have. After passing through security without issue, he walked toward his gate. As he approached, he noticed a woman standing nearby. She was dressed in expensive clothes, holding a designer purse, and had an air of superiority about her. She glanced at him, then at his first-class ticket. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. Carter found a seat near the boarding area, pulled out a book, and began reading. He didn't notice the woman still watching him. Minutes passed, and soon the gate agent announced that first-class passengers could begin boarding. Carter stood up, grabbed his carry-on, and walked toward the gate. As he handed his ticket to the agent, he heard a sharp voice behind him. "Excuse me, are you sure that's the right ticket?" Carter turned around. It was the woman from earlier. She looked at him with suspicion, as if he had done something wrong. The gate agent, confused by the question, glanced at Carter's ticket again. "Yes, Mom. This is a first-class boarding pass." The woman crossed her arms. "There must be some mistake. I paid a lot of money for first class. This is supposed to be an exclusive section." Carter remained calm, but he could already tell where this was going. He had dealt with people like her before, people who judge without knowing anything about a person. "I believe we're both flying first class," Carter said politely. The woman gave a short, annoyed laugh. "I just find it interesting how some people manage to get these seats." Carter said nothing. He had nothing to prove to her. The gate agent, sensing tension, quickly ushered Carter through. He stepped onto the plane and made his way to his window seat in first class. He stored his bag in the overhead bin, sat down, and got comfortable. A few minutes later, the same woman entered the first-class cabin. The moment she saw Carter sitting in his seat, her expression changed. She paused in the aisle, looking at him as if something wasn't right. Then, instead of going to her own seat, she waved down a flight attendant. "I think there's been a mistake," she said in a firm voice. "That man is sitting in first class. Are you sure he belongs here?" The flight attendant, a young woman with years of experience handling difficult passengers, gave a polite but professional smile. "Yes, ma'am. His ticket is valid for first class." The woman sighed, clearly unhappy. "Well, I just hope he didn't take someone else's seat by mistake." Carter simply shook his head and looked out the window, choosing to ignore her. He had faced real challenges in life. This was nothing. As the plane began to fill up, Admiral James Carter remained calm in his seat, looking out the window. He had traveled many times before, and he knew how people could behave on flights. But this time, something felt different. He could still feel the eyes of the woman from earlier on him. She wasn't just annoyed. She was watching him closely, almost waiting for something to happen. A few minutes later, the final boarding announcement was made. Passengers hurried down the aisle, looking for their seats. The woman who had questioned his place in first class finally took her seat a few rows ahead of him. But instead of letting it go, she kept glancing back as if checking to make sure he was still there. Carter ignored it. He had been in far worse situations than dealing with an upset passenger. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes for a moment, and took a deep breath. Just as he was beginning to relax, he heard her voice again. "Excuse me, flight attendant." A young flight attendant with a polite smile walked over. "Yes, Mom. How can I help you?" The woman gestured toward Carter without even looking at him. "I just want to make sure that this section is reserved for paying customers. I know first class isn't cheap." The flight attendant blinked, clearly surprised by the comment. "Yes, ma'am. This is first class. All the passengers here have valid tickets." The woman sighed, as if she wasn't satisfied with the answer. "Well, I just want to be sure. I worked hard for this seat. I wouldn't want anyone taking advantage of an upgrade they didn't deserve." Carter slowly opened his eyes, but he still said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words. The flight attendant, now looking a little uncomfortable, smiled again and said, "All tickets were checked before boarding, ma'am. Everyone in this section is supposed to be here." The woman forced a smile. "Oh, I understand. It's just, you never know these days." Carter knew exactly what she meant. He had dealt with subtle comments like this before, remarks that weren't direct, but carried a clear meaning. Still, he remained quiet, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. The flight attendant gave a polite nod and walked away, leaving the woman still glancing back every now and then. A few moments later, the captain's voice came over the speakers, welcoming everyone to the flight and announcing the expected travel time. The engines roared to life, and soon, the plane was taxiing toward the runway. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, Carter stared out the window, watching the city disappear below. He was used to flying, but there was always something peaceful about watching the world from above. The seatbelt sign turned off, and flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks. Carter accepted a bottle of water and thanked the attendant. But just as he was about to take a sip, he noticed movement from the woman's seat. She had unbuckled her seatbelt and was walking toward the front of the cabin. Instead of heading to the restroom, she stopped by the flight attendant station and spoke to one of them in a hushed voice. Carter couldn't hear everything she was saying, but he caught a few words. "Just checking. I think there's a mistake." The flight attendant nodded, listening patiently. After a moment, she glanced back at Carter, then politely reassured the woman once again. But this time, the woman shook her head. "No, I'd like to speak to the pilot." At this, Carter raised an eyebrow. She was taking this even further. He had expected the annoyed glances and the whispered complaints, but now she wanted to involve the captain. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly unsure how to handle the request. "Ma'am, the captain is currently flying the plane. Is there something specific you need help with?" The woman crossed her arms. "Yes, I believe there's a mistake in first class, and I want the pilot to confirm it." The flight attendant, now looking slightly embarrassed, nodded and walked toward the cockpit. Carter sighed, shaking his head. He had spent years leading sailors, dealing with difficult situations and handling stressful environments. Yet here he was, thousands of feet in the air, watching a woman desperately try to prove that he didn't belong in a seat that he had every right to be in. What she didn't know was that the moment the pilot arrived, the truth would change everything. The flight was smooth, and most passengers had settled into their seats, either watching movies, reading, or resting. But Admiral James Carter could feel the tension still hanging in the air. The woman, who had been questioning his place in first class since the moment she saw him, had now escalated things further. She had asked to speak to the pilot. Carter took a deep breath and shook his head slightly. He had been through so much in his career, leading men into dangerous missions, making life-and-death decisions, and dealing with real crises. This, however, was something else entirely. He had seen people judge him before, but rarely had anyone gone this far to prove whatever point they were trying to make. A few minutes later, a flight attendant returned with a slightly uncomfortable look on her face. She leaned down and whispered something to the woman, but whatever she said didn't seem to satisfy her. The woman shook her head and spoke in a low but firm voice. I want the pilot to confirm that every person in this section is supposed to be here." Carter could hear the frustration in the flight attendant's sigh. She gave a polite nod and walked toward the front of the cabin. Carter remained calm, sipping his water and staring out the window. He wasn't going to let this woman ruin his flight, but he knew that once the pilot got involved, things would take a turn. A few minutes later, the cockpit door opened and the pilot stepped out. He was an older man with a calm and authoritative presence, the kind that came from years of experience. He had probably dealt with all kinds of situations on flights before, but he didn't seem pleased about being called out for this one. He walked toward the woman, who immediately sat up straighter, as if she had won some kind of battle. "Captain," she began, in a tone that suggested she was doing the airline a great favor, "I just wanted to bring something to your attention. I believe there's been a mistake with the seating arrangement in first class." The pilot raised an eyebrow. "A mistake?" "Yes," she said quickly. "I know that first class is for passengers who paid for their seats, and, well, I just wanted to be sure that everyone here actually belongs." The pilot turned his head slightly, glancing around the cabin. His eyes landed on Carter for a moment before looking back at the woman. "Ma'am," he said in a calm but firm tone, "I can assure you that everyone in this section has been properly ticketed." The woman gave a tight smile. "I understand that, but I just think it would be good to double-check. You never know how some people end up in first class." At this point, the passengers sitting nearby had started to take notice. A few exchanged glances, some shook their heads. One man across the aisle let out a quiet chuckle, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Carter remained silent, but he could feel all eyes shifting between him, the woman, and the pilot. The pilot exhaled, clearly running out of patience. "Ma'am, are you questioning someone's right to be here?" The woman hesitated for a brief second, but then lifted her chin. "I just want to be sure. After all, I paid a lot for this seat." The pilot turned toward Carter and gave him a polite nod. "Sir, may I ask your name?" Carter set down his water bottle, straightened up, and finally spoke. His voice was steady, firm, and carried the kind of authority that came naturally to someone who had spent decades in leadership. "Admiral James Carter, United States Navy." The moment he said it, the entire cabin seemed to fall into silence. The air changed. The woman's expression shifted from confidence to confusion, and then to something close to panic. The pilot's eyes flickered with recognition, and then a slight smile formed on his lips. "Admiral," he said with respect, giving a small nod. "It's an honor, sir." Carter returned the nod. "Thank you, Captain." The woman, however, looked completely stunned. She blinked a few times, as if trying to process what she had just heard. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The passengers around them, who had been listening closely, suddenly had a new energy in their eyes. Some whispered among themselves, others smirked. The chuckling man across the aisle grinned even wider. The pilot turned back to the woman, his polite smile now carrying a hint of amusement. "Ma'am, I can assure you, Admiral Carter has more than earned his seat in first class." The woman's face turned a shade paler. For the first time since the flight started, she had nothing to say. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted in an instant. What had been a tense, uncomfortable moment only moments before now felt completely different. The woman, once so confident and determined to have Carter removed from his seat, was now speechless. Her face had drained of color, and she could no longer look anyone in the eye. Admiral Carter, however, remained calm. He wasn't looking for a confrontation. He wasn't the type of person to get involved in unnecessary drama. But something about the woman's attitude had struck a nerve. She had judged him simply because of his appearance and assumed he didn't belong in first class. Now, with the truth revealed, she was forced to face the reality that her assumptions had been completely wrong. The pilot, still standing at the front of the cabin, addressed the woman with a quiet but firm tone. "Ma'am, I'm sure you understand that our passengers are all treated with respect. We don't question who belongs here based on appearances. I suggest you take your seat and relax for the rest of the flight." The woman nodded mutely, still unable to speak. She quickly returned to her seat, her posture stiff, and her eyes fixed on the floor. Carter could tell she was embarrassed, but she didn't apologize. In fact, she didn't say another word for the remainder of the flight. The passengers around them, however, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The tension that had been hanging in the air had lifted, replaced by an atmosphere of calm. A few people, including the man across the aisle who had been laughing earlier, glanced at Carter with respectful nods, acknowledging the quiet dignity with which he had handled the situation. Carter settled back in his seat, feeling the weight of the moment lift off his shoulders. He had never been one for confrontation, especially in situations that didn't warrant it. But when someone disrespects him or anyone else based solely on assumptions, that's a different matter entirely. As the flight continued, the crew made their rounds, offering drinks and snacks. Carter declined most of them, preferring to stay quiet and keep to himself. He watched the clouds drift by outside, lost in thought. The woman's actions hadn't bothered him nearly as much as the fact that her behavior reflected a mindset that still existed in the world. People who judged others based on how they looked, where they came from, or what they wore. The captain returned to the front of the cabin, his voice coming over the intercom once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now cruising at 35,000 feet. We're expecting smooth skies for the remainder of the flight. Feel free to relax and enjoy the rest of your trip." Despite the earlier tension, the rest of the flight went without incident. The woman did her best to avoid looking at Carter, and he continued to read his book, occasionally glancing out the window. The rest of the passengers, too, seemed content to enjoy the calm of the flight. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with a renewed sense of ease. The tension had dissipated, and everyone seemed more relaxed. Even the woman, though she still hadn't spoken, appeared to be in less of a hurry to get off the plane. Admiral Carter remained seated, letting the events unfold without allowing them to affect him too much. He had seen and experienced much worse in his time. And this was just another example of how sometimes people need a reminder that assumptions don't always tell the whole story. He had earned his seat in first class, not just because of his status, but because of his years of service and dedication to his country. As the plane started its descent, Carter began to prepare for landing. He checked his seatbelt and sat up straighter, glancing around the cabin one last time. The woman, now completely silent, was staring out the window. She was clearly still processing what had happened. And though Carter had no interest in making her feel worse, he couldn't help but think that this was a lesson she would not soon forget. Soon, the plane touched down smoothly, the wheels hitting the tarmac with a soft hum. The seatbelt sign dinged, and the crew began their final checks. As the plane taxied to the gate, Carter stood up and gathered his belongings. The woman was still sitting in her seat, looking straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with anyone. When the plane came to a complete stop, the flight attendants began to open the doors. Carter walked calmly down the aisle, passing the woman as he did. She didn't look up. He reached the door and stepped out onto the jetway, feeling the familiar rush of air and the warmth of the terminal. It was a long day ahead, but as always, he would carry on, knowing that sometimes the best response to ignorance is simply letting the truth speak for itself. As Admiral Carter walked down the jetway, he couldn't help but reflect on the strange events of the flight. The moment when the woman had questioned his presence in first class felt like an unnecessary interruption to what should have been a simple, peaceful journey. But now, as he moved through the terminal and toward baggage claim, he realized that sometimes situations like these provided a lesson for others, and for himself. Carter had spent decades in the Navy, a career that had taken him all over the world, dealing with high-stakes situations and difficult people. Yet there was something about this incident that stuck with him. It wasn't about the confrontation. It was about the reminder of how far some people would go to judge others, often based on nothing more than their own assumptions. He shook his head and tried to push the thoughts aside. The flight was over now, and he had things to do. As he made his way toward the baggage claim area, he noticed a group of people standing nearby, talking in low voices. They glanced over at him as he walked past, but Carter didn't pay them much attention. He had been in the spotlight many times before, but he wasn't one to seek it out. When he reached the baggage carousel, he stood back, watching as luggage slowly began to circle around. He didn't mind waiting. Time spent alone gave him a chance to gather his thoughts, to think about his work, his experiences, and his future. A few minutes later, a man approached him. He was older, with silver hair and a warm smile. "Excuse me, Admiral," he said, extending his hand. "I just wanted to say thank you for your service. It's an honor to meet you." Carter looked up, surprised. He shook the man's hand, smiling politely. "Thank you. It's always nice to meet people who appreciate the work we do." The man nodded. "I was on your flight, sitting a few rows behind you. I couldn't help but overhear what happened with that lady in first class. It was really something to witness. I'm glad you handled it so well." Carter raised an eyebrow. He hadn't realized that anyone had noticed the situation on the plane. But it seemed like the news had spread. The man continued, "I saw the way she treated you, and it made me angry. People like that don't understand the sacrifices you've made, but you didn't let her get to you. And that's something I respect." Carter gave a slight smile. "Thank you. But I don't think she meant any harm. She just got caught up in her assumptions. It happens." The man shook his head. "Not like that. What she did was out of line. You handled it with grace, though. I think a lot of people would have reacted differently." Carter shrugged. "It wasn't a big deal. There's no need to make it into something it wasn't." The man looked at him for a moment, as if trying to read him. "You know, I've met a lot of people in my life, but there's something about your attitude that stands out. It's not just about rank or position. It's about the way you carry yourself. I can tell you've earned respect." Carter felt a small sense of pride at the compliment, but he didn't show it. He wasn't one to boast about his career or talk about the things he had done. Instead, he simply nodded in acknowledgement. The man smiled. "Well, I just wanted to thank you again. People like you make a difference, whether they know it or not." Before Carter could respond, the baggage carousel gave a small chime, signaling that his bag had arrived. He reached out, grabbed it, and gave the man one last nod. "Take care," Carter said. The man waved as he walked off, and Carter watched him disappear into the crowd. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the conversation sink in. It wasn't often that people took the time to thank him for his service. Most of the time, he preferred to go unnoticed. But today had been different. Today had shown him that even small acts of kindness, like offering a simple thank you, could make a bigger impact than anyone realized. As he exited the terminal and headed toward his car, Carter couldn't help but think back to the woman on the plane. She had made assumptions about him, had tried to undermine his presence in first class, and had tried to make him feel like he didn't belong. But in the end, it wasn't her judgment that mattered. It was the respect he had earned over a lifetime of dedication and service. And that respect, he realized, was something that no one could take away. He climbed into his car and started the engine, ready to move on with his day. There was always more to do, more work to be done. But now, with the events of the flight behind him, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that sometimes standing firm in your own truth was all it took to make the world right again. Admiral Carter drove in silence as he made his way through the city. The roads were busy, but the steady rhythm of his car on the pavement allowed him to clear his mind. The events of the flight still lingered in his thoughts, but he was beginning to realize that it wasn't about what had happened in the air. It was about what had happened afterward. The way the man in the terminal had recognized him, had appreciated his restraint, and had taken a moment to thank him for his service. That had stuck with him more than anything else. He turned the corner, approaching the familiar road that led to his home. The steady rhythm of life continued, and the world outside seemed unaffected by the small drama that had played out on that plane. But inside, something had shifted. He had always known that his rank as an admiral meant respect, but it wasn't until that encounter on the flight that he truly understood how deep that respect ran. It wasn't just about authority or power, it was about integrity, and the quiet way in which one carries themselves. As he pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, Carter sat there for a moment, deep in thought. The woman on the plane had no idea who he was when she first questioned his right to sit in first class. She had no clue about his career or the sacrifices he had made to get where he was. She had only seen him as a man in a seat that she didn't think belonged to him. But now, after hearing his name, after seeing the pilot's respectful acknowledgement, she knew the truth. And Carter wondered if that truth had done anything to change her. He stepped out of the car and walked toward his front door. The house was quiet, as always. Carter had never been one to fill his home with noise or distractions. He preferred solitude, a place where he could reflect on the world around him. Inside, he poured himself a glass of water and sat down at the kitchen table, feeling the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. The flight had been over, but the ripple effects of that brief encounter were still with him. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking his thoughts. He picked it up and saw a message from one of his colleagues. The text was brief, but it made him smile. "Admiral, just wanted to let you know that we got the paperwork sorted out. Thanks again for everything." It was a simple message, but it reminded him of the work that lay ahead. There would always be more tasks, more responsibilities, more people to lead. But for now, he took a moment to sit in the quiet of his home, reflecting on the little moments that made it all worthwhile. After a while, Carter stood up and walked to his study, where a bookshelf lined the wall. He ran his hand along the spines of the books, feeling the familiar texture of well-worn leather and paper. He wasn't in the mood for anything too serious, so he pulled down a book of short stories and opened it to the first page. As he read, his mind began to unwind, and he allowed himself a small break from the weight of leadership, from the constant responsibility. The evening passed quickly, and Carter found himself thinking about the woman on the flight again. He wondered if she had learned anything from the encounter. Had she realized that sometimes people aren't who they appear to be on the surface? Had she understood that judging someone based on assumptions was never the right path? Carter didn't know. He didn't expect an apology or any kind of acknowledgement from her. In his experience, some people didn't change overnight, and others never changed at all. As the night grew later, Carter finally closed the book and set it down on the table. He stood up, stretching, and made his way toward the living room. He sat in his favorite chair, a worn leather recliner that had been with him for years, and he gazed out the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and the world outside seemed calm. But inside, Carter knew that even the smallest moments, like the one he had experienced on the plane, could leave lasting impressions. Tomorrow would be another day of work, another day of moving forward. But for tonight, he could take a deep breath and let go of the frustrations of the day. He had done his part. He had shown grace under pressure, and he had remained true to who he was. And sometimes, that was enough. As he turned off the lights and headed to bed, Carter felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt earlier. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that, no matter the challenges, he would always stand firm in his truth. The next morning, Admiral Carter woke up early, as he always did. The sun had just started to rise, casting a soft light through the windows of his bedroom. He stretched, taking a deep breath, and felt the calmness of the morning seep into his bones. There was something comforting about starting the day with a quiet routine. It was a chance to gather his thoughts, prepare for the challenges ahead, and set the tone for everything that would come next. After a quick shower, he made himself a simple breakfast, a cup of coffee and some toast. He didn't need anything fancy to start his day. The simplicity of it suited him. He ate in silence, savoring the peace before the day's responsibilities took over. His mind briefly drifted back to the flight the day before, but he quickly shook off the lingering thoughts. It was time to move forward. As he finished his breakfast, Carter glanced at the clock on the wall. He had a full schedule ahead of him, but he wasn't in a rush. The work he did had always been important, but he had learned to take it one step at a time. He understood the value of patience and the need for quiet reflection before making decisions. After cleaning up, he grabbed his coat and headed out the door, locking it behind him. The air outside was cool but refreshing, the kind of crisp air that cleared your mind and made everything feel fresh. He started his car and made his way to the office, the familiar roads of the city guiding him without hesitation. On his way, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from a fellow officer. The message was short and to the point, but it made him smile. "Morning, Admiral. We're ready for the meeting at noon. Just wanted to check in." Carter replied with a simple acknowledgement and then set the phone down. He didn't need distractions while driving. The day was unfolding before him, and he was determined to face whatever came with the same calm determination that he had carried for years. When he arrived at the office, the building was quiet, the morning still unfolding at a gentle pace. Carter walked through the halls, nodding at a few colleagues who passed by. It wasn't a large office, but it was efficient, and he preferred it that way. He didn't need any unnecessary clutter or distractions. The work was what mattered most. He sat down at his desk and started going through the day's agenda. There were meetings, updates on ongoing projects, and reports to review, but Carter didn't mind. He was used to it. The work kept him grounded, kept him focused. It was a reminder that no matter what had happened on the plane, his role was clear. He had a job to do, and that job required all of his attention. As the morning went on, the office slowly began to fill with more people. There were conversations in the hallways, people discussing reports and sharing updates. But Carter didn't get caught up in the buzz. He focused on his tasks, working steadily through the list of things that needed his attention. He was always careful with his time, making sure he balanced his work with moments of clarity and calm. By noon, it was time for the meeting. Carter joined the group in the conference room, where colleagues gathered around a long table. They greeted him warmly, and he took his seat at the head of the table. He glanced at the agenda, prepared to lead the discussion with the same methodical approach that had served him so well over the years. The meeting proceeded smoothly, with everyone contributing ideas and sharing updates. Carter asked thoughtful questions and offered suggestions where needed, but overall, he allowed his team to lead the conversation. He trusted them to handle their own areas of responsibility. He was there to guide, not to control. As the meeting came to a close, Carter felt a sense of satisfaction. The work was progressing, and the team was in good hands. It wasn't always easy, but there was a sense of pride in knowing that he had played a role in helping people succeed. The decisions made today would affect their work moving forward, and that, in itself, was a reward. When the meeting ended, Carter made his way back to his office, feeling the weight of the day lift off his shoulders. There was always more to do, but for now, he could take a moment to relax. He grabbed his phone and checked the messages. Another text popped up, this time from one of his friends. "Hey, how are things going after yesterday? I saw the news about the flight incident. Glad you handled it so well." Carter smiled as he read the message. It seemed that the story had already made its way around. He didn't want to get into the details of it, but he appreciated the support. He quickly replied, "It's all good, just part of the job." The rest of the afternoon passed without much fanfare. There were more reports to review and calls to return, but it all felt manageable. Carter moved through it all with the same calm composure, just as he always did. As Admiral Carter walked out of the office building, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The day had been productive, but it had also been filled with moments of reflection. The flight incident, though now behind him, still lingered in his mind, but he knew it was just one chapter in the ongoing story of his life. There were always challenges to face, But Carter had learned long ago that the key to overcoming them was maintaining composure and understanding that not every situation required a reaction. He walked to his car, his thoughts calm and steady. It was a familiar feeling, the satisfaction of a day well spent, and the anticipation of returning home to the peace he valued so much. The evening air was cool as he got in and started the engine, the car's hum almost a comforting background to the quiet of the world outside. The drive home was uneventful, the roads clear and quiet. Carter didn't mind the solitude. It gave him time to think, to process the day, and to prepare for whatever might come next. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that as long as he continued to carry himself with integrity and grace, he could face anything that came his way. When he arrived at home, he parked the car in the driveway and stepped out, stretching his legs as he looked around. His home was small but cozy, a reflection of the life he had chosen. There were no grandiose displays of wealth or status, just a simple space where he could unwind and be himself. He liked it that way. Inside, he took off his coat and set it on the chair by the door. The house was quiet, just the way he preferred it. He went into the kitchen, making himself a simple dinner, a bowl of soup and some bread. He didn't need anything extravagant. After the busy day, he was content with something warm and comforting. As he ate, his mind drifted again to the woman on the plane. Carter wasn't angry at her. He didn't hold any resentment. What bothered him was how easily she had jumped to conclusions based on his appearance, without taking the time to understand who he was or what he had achieved. It wasn't the first time he had encountered such assumptions, and it wouldn't be the last. But every time it happened, it reminded him that people often saw what they wanted to see rather than the truth. Carter finished his meal and cleaned up, the quiet of the evening settling around him. The phone buzzed again, this time with a call from one of his old friends. He smiled as he picked it up. "Hey, Carter. How's it going?" The voice on the other end said warmly. "Not bad," Carter replied. "Just winding down after a busy day." "You still handling everything okay after that flight situation?" his friend asked. Carter chuckled lightly. "Yeah, it's all good. You know how it is. People jump to conclusions, but you just have to roll with it." "I saw the news. Everyone's talking about it," his friend said. "But you handled it with class, as always." Carter appreciated the kind words, but he didn't want to dwell on it. It wasn't anything, just one of those things. There was a brief pause on the other end before his friend spoke again. "Well, you know you've earned respect from a lot of people. What happened yesterday just reminded everyone of that." Carter nodded, even though his friend couldn't see him. "Thanks. I appreciate that." The conversation shifted to other topics, but the words from his friend lingered in his mind. Respect wasn't something easily earned, and it wasn't something that could be taken away. It was built over time, through actions and decisions, and it was something that no one could change with a single interaction. As the evening wore on, Carter settled into his usual routine. He read a book for a while, then spent some time reflecting on the events of the past week. He knew that life would continue to challenge him, and that there would always be moments that tested his patience and resolve. But those moments, he realized, were just part of the journey. They didn't define him. They only served to strengthen him. Before heading to bed, he took a moment to look out the window at the city lights in the distance. It was a peaceful sight, one that reminded him of the quiet resilience of everyday life. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic moments. Sometimes, just standing firm in your own truth was all that was needed. Carter turned off the lights and climbed into bed, feeling the weight of the day ease away. The world outside was still, and inside, he felt at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new experiences, but for now, he was content. He had faced what had come his way with dignity and respect, and that was all that mattered. As he closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep, he knew that no matter what happened next, he would always carry himself with the same quiet strength, ready to face whatever came, just as he always had.